Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2017, presents INTERPHEX Live.
Welcome to our last conference of the day. As I've been informed, we stand between you and cocktail hour, so we'll try to make this as entertaining as possible.
That means no questions.
Yeah, well, we'll see to that. Okay, now, we're going to be talking about flexibility and the future of flexibility in manufacturing. And so, my first question is tunability or flexibility? Which is it, Jeff?
It depends.
Yeah.
You know, if you think about, as an organization, what your long-term business goals are, you may be in a situation where you truly need flexibility, but in the grand scheme of things, you can't afford it, or you think you can't afford it. So you want to be able to fine-tune the assets that you have. You know, for us, when you think about this definition of flexibility, it can mean so many different things, and it has to do with where you are in the pipeline development. It has to do with the type of products that you deal with. So it's, you know, there's no real pat answer, I don't think.
Yeah, we find something similar. I mean, one of the first questions we ask for clients that are looking for a flexible facility is, what kind of flexibility are you really looking for? Are you looking for flexibility in terms of scale? Are you talking about multiple projects or products with quick changeover? Are you talking about flexibility to introduce new products or expand later on? And so that conversation needs to be had up front so that we understand exactly what the project goals are before we initiate the project.
That's good. That's a good point, because the reason I brought it up is invariably when you start to talk about flexibility and tunability, people think about more or less. They don't talk about changeover, and they don't talk about being able to tweak the process, or I think that's the key. So in a lot of cases, I think we in the development area and the engineering group, we want to make sure we set the record straight there. So another misconception, and this is something that runs into it, I'm sure we run afoul of this a couple of times today. A lot of people think because it's tunable or because it's flexible, it is therefore continuous. So why don't we set that record? Though, does flexible mean I'm working continuous, or?
Well, I think continuous manufacturing gives one element of flexibility. And the nicest advantage of that is that you have the flexibility with regard to production size. It's really the area under the curve in terms of time that you're running a continuous process. So you can run it for a very short period for a small yield, very long period for a much larger production volume. And in some cases, you can use the same facility for both clinical and commercial applications for that reason, if that's part of your plan. But in another aspect, I think continuous manufacturing is less flexible in that it's got to be designed from day one. It's got to be part of your process development. And so if you have a platform process that is continuous and all your products are on that platform, that's great. That's all the flexibility you need. But if you are looking at a great deal of variation in that continuous manufacturing process, it could be that the type of flexibility you need is something different.
Yeah, it's if you think about continuous from the standpoint of throughput, one of the problems that we find a lot of companies running into is that as you look at risk assessment, the continuous process is not very forgiving. And part of the challenge then becomes, how much are you willing to accept from a risk standpoint? And to a lot of companies that sort of still live in their box, the answer is, I'm not willing to accept a lot because I don't want to get outside of the parameters that I've been operating under and licensed under for the last decade or two. So it is, you're right.
Yeah. I think that's a great point, Jeff, and it's particularly true for biologics because the big risk in biologics is bioburden control. And so with a continuous process, in most cases you have to operate that under azenic or aseptic conditions over a very long period, and that's difficult and very challenging to do. If you're talking about an API that's not aseptic, of course it's a different, chemical synthesis, a different ballgame. But certainly the risk depends on what kind of process you're operating with.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of cases, people don't give enough thought to that. I couldn't tell you how many times we'll get called on a process that's clearly a continuous process, and they want to know what else they can make. I mean, that's a hell of a question, considering that you hadn't thought about that in the outset. And that's certainly not flexible, okay? I think that's something, and I think that's important to understand. I think it has to be built in. So what are the key areas of focus in terms of the design? In other words, we don't want to get into this 1,000-kilo boat anchor, as we prefer to call it. You're kind of married to this thing. So what are the key areas that we got to focus on in terms of design that drive the basis for flexible engine manufacturing?
Well, I think one of them you just touched on. If you think about the idea of flexibility today, a lot of it centers around scale of operation. We have seen over the past few years how facility assets have begun to shrink, and yet their throughput capability is as large or larger because of the advances in the science. So scale plays a big part of that. One of the things that if you truly think about flexibility and relate it to the term agility from a manufacturing standpoint, if you are in a multi-phase, multi-product kind of scenario, you've got to pay a lot of attention to changeover. Changeover is something that for a lot of organizations becomes a big challenge. You want to minimize the risk, but you also want to maximize the efficiency. So I think changeover is part of it. If you think about most of the manufacturing facilities that are going online today or in design, and as you walk through the exhibit hall, you now have an element that is becoming more and more of an issue, and that's how do you handle the waste? Not just the traditional waste that we're used to from the standpoint of the process itself, but now you've got these elements of the solid waste, and depending on where you are geographically, that can become a big issue because some locations just aren't as friendly as others. One other thing that I alluded to before is this understanding of operational risk. Most of the clients that we deal with and have interaction with today are beginning to realize that risk is becoming such a huge part of the understanding of the enterprise. How do you relate all the elements in synergy so that you truly understand where your risks are? And then I think the last one is probably this idea of expandability. How do I create an asset that at the end of the day, if my business goes well or if I have the opportunity to expand, how can I do that and minimize the impact of what goes on a day-to-day basis? Probably most of us have lived through the nightmare of having to retrofit and expand facilities, but at the same time, keep them operational and running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so the expandability asset comes in as well.
Well, Dave, let me ask you this one. So to get back to the operational, what operational features of design? If I want to go from one process to another. I mean, so that I don't get into a situation where I impact other products, production suite. You know what I'm saying? And like I said,
sure.
Don't call me in after the fact, say, what else can I make? I mean, that question should have been asked by the design team when you guys envisioned what you were going to talk. So what aspects, when you go in and work with clients? I mean,
Well,
I'm sorry.
one at a time, guys.
okay, all right.
Go ahead, Dave.
I'll acquiesce, he's bigger than I am.
Taller.
Okay.
So I think that we have a much better technical toolbox to work with now to create flexibility in facilities than we had years ago. We have single use, which is a maturing technology, and depending on the type of flexibility you're looking for, that's a real excellent vehicle to run multiple products with a very rapid changeover. Another but if you're talking about a traditional stainless system, then you might be looking at automation schemes with recipes and optimized CIP cycles and things of that nature that create flexibility. So it really depends on, I think, the scale, the type of product, the type of process, and you've got to, I think, keep all of your options open early on in the design process to understand what the client's what our client, when we're designing a facility, is trying to achieve, and until you narrow that toolbox of technology. It's not just the facility, it's not just the process. I think you've got to tackle both facility and process together in an integrated fashion and look at where the segregation is, so that, because your biggest risk is going to be product cross-contamination if you're talking multiple products. And and the way you do this through segregation is either going to be through environment, through equipment, through some kind of barrier. You got to look at utilities and possible cross-contamination via that. So it is a complex process, and the answer is not a pat answer for every manufacturer, even if you're talking about the same process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Dave, and one of the areas that unfortunately is not addressed in the very beginning is this whole idea of segregation strategy. And it's more than just the attributes of the facility. You have to think about equipment design, your ability to define and validate system closure. What are the things that you're going to do to ensure product protection? And tying this strategy together from the very beginning is something that I think, as an industry, we sort of got away from it because we started, okay, we'll put everything in a grade C environment and life is good and air is cheap, so we'll pump it through and we'll make everybody wear all these layers of gowns, and that was sort of the standard. And now, as Dave alluded to, there's so many different tools that we have at our disposal that can really help you define this strategy from the very beginning. And it makes a huge difference, both from an efficiency standpoint and a utilization standpoint.
Yeah. So getting on that efficiency I think GE was just in here and we talked about a lot of their new films and single use. To me, how do you efficiently design something to be single use, and the components? How do you get them in? How do you get them out? What are the design aspects? I think I got a sense that comes, a lot of people put that after the cart. In other words, they've already decided what they're going to do, and then say, oh yeah, single use is a good idea. Well, that ship has sailed. So before the ship sails, Jeff, what do we got to be thinking about?
Well, you've heard the old saying, you have to design with the end in mind. And part of the challenge that most organizations get into is they love the technology and they understand and they see all the benefits, but they need to stop and think about what happens day in and day out. How do I get this component from point A to point B? How do I get this material from point A to point B? How does all this fit within my operational scheme? And a lot of times that's where we fall short. And if you look at where technology is today, and I'll use GE as an example, where they are today versus where they were 10 years ago, it's been a huge improvement in capabilities and technologies and the ability to do things that, a decade ago we just sort of thought about. But it doesn't matter how great the components are if you can't sit there and understand how you have to use it on a day-to-day basis. It's like, you go out and you spend $250,000 on a sports car that's a manual shift and you can't drive it. Doesn't do you any good. And I think that's where one of the challenges comes in. Big challenge.
Yeah, I think one of the big misunderstandings or misperceptions is that you can just go out and buy a modular clean room, install it, and then worry about what you're going to put in it.
Yep.
But a well-designed, compliant facility is going to require a really thoughtful process where you look at the material material flows throughout the facility, the people, the equipment, and the waste flow. Because you don't want that crossover, and how that's all segregated from other products in order to design the facility well. And one of the things that we've seen, particularly with single use, is a lot of times people don't think through the staging and the flow of equipment and products. So single use is great in the sense that everything's on wheels usually. You can just move things around, roll the bag down the hall, and it's easy. But some of their processes require substantial buffer supplies, substantial drain and waste handling. And so you've got to think through that whole process well. Starting right at the loading dock, having areas or places where you can handle all the packaging and the inventory space for all the single-use tube sets and assemblies, and having adequate inventory to ensure that your supply chain is secure.
Yep.
When you're single use, your process is highly tied to those single use assemblies, and so that supply chain's got to be ultra secure. And part of that strategy is designing a facility that can support that.
We had touched on that before, and I think one of the things, we'll get back into that, and one of them is, how do you dispense the components, how do you control the components? I mean, that's a quality dimension. I don't know if we're going to get to that, but my concern is if you got three processes running, how do you stop from stumbling over each other? I mean, what you recommend? You know what I'm saying? You're going to interfere with each other. So why don't we take that? So Jeff, I mean, what's your recommendations on that when you design something?
Well, again, if you start the process from the standpoint of an understanding of where you want to go, the technology exists for finding ways to run multiple processes within a facility, providing adequate protection that meets what the regulatory expectations are. The problem is that for a lot of organizations, that thought process and in particular I'll call them the touch points. If you think about something as simple as your iPhone. Well, your iPhone is a very complex piece of equipment, but yet the interface points make it just as easy to use. Well, except maybe for me, but it's an easy technology to use. Well, part of the issue that you run into when you start to look at running multiple operations is how do you deal with those interface points? What becomes the issue on a day-to-day basis from a design standpoint that you have to address? Dave alluded to them earlier. If you're running a certain level of an automation platform, is it compatible across these different process elements? If you have a particular scenario where you're within a set of boundaries and then you've got an outlier in buffers, for example, all right, how do you address that? And being able to integrate from the very beginning these interface points becomes huge. But you have to understand that when you start this process. If you go through and all of a sudden go, oh crap, I forgot something, it's not impossible, but it's difficult, it's expensive, and it's time consuming to address.
So again, getting on that operational interference between processes, Dave, what's your take?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that you can do is you can model the manufacturing process, and we do that frequently, where we're expecting either high traffic or a lot of complex interactions. And I mean, one of the very common areas of modeling is CIP cycles relative to process equipment, to make sure that changeover is quick, efficient, and you don't have possibility of cross-contamination, right? But you also have to look if you have high traffic in certain aisles and things like that. You have to look at the timing of your manufacturing and where that traffic will be, and design your facilities so that you don't get pinch points that are going to slow you down. Time is money in these facilities, so they've got to operate fast, efficient, and whenever you have bottlenecks or places where things slow down, there's possibility of creating quality issues as well. So you want them smooth and.
I think the other thing that I've found frustrating myself was lack of capacity from a utility standpoint. Yeah, I have 2 kettles.
Yep.
But so you go in and everything looks dandy. You bring them both online, you can't get temperature. I didn't say I could run 2 kettles. I said I had 2 kettles.
Yeah.
No, we've seen that over and over. Oftentimes it's not necessarily a facility that we've designed, but clients.
Well, yeah,
saying,
but you're
saying,
stuck
hey,
with it.
Either we didn't think about this scenario when we were building it, or the firm didn't plan for it, or we've changed something. Okay, now all at once we don't have enough waste processing. We don't have enough clean steam, whatever. And so you do have to plan that carefully and work through those issues in order to make sure, and that's part of the modeling too. You look at the diversity and the usage of those utilities through each stage of manufacturing, and if it's multi-product or a phased production, then you've got to look at where those overlap periods are, where utility demands are going to peak, and make sure you have the capacity either to generate and keep up with it, or to buffer with supply tanks and things like Wi-Fi. I mean, that's another area where you can run short.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, that's beyond a pinch point.
Right.
It's like I want to hit them over the head with a chair, But I mean, from a design standpoint, a lot of times you're stuck with that. And so you guys, we triage that by doing URS. How do you guys make sure that we vetted all that? How's that?
Well, you do have a lot of tools available today, and some of the modeling tools are actually pretty simple to use, which it's a value added kind of scenario where you can get a real good sense of where the pinch points are. Then the challenge becomes the solution to address it, because there are usually a number of different options that you're going to have. They're going to have different cost components and schedule components and risk components tied to them. And a lot of times what we've seen is the consensus of the decision is not as easy to come up with as you would think, because manufacturing will have one idea, quality will have another idea. The maintenance folks may see both of those as something that is not acceptable, and something as simple as a consensus can be pretty difficult in those situations.
Yeah, I think the best way to address that problem is not to get into it in the first place. So you've got to look at this at the front end engineering. You've got to go through a conceptual design phase where you're looking at all those issues, and if you designed and you understand all your loads correctly, and they don't change, then your facility should be more than adequate, because you always build a little bit of extra capacity for contingencies, of course. But oftentimes you don't have that luxury. We're coming in, and a good example, we had a client came to us some time ago. They had a process chiller, not enough capacity. The space they had in was really not big enough to fit a larger process chiller, and even if they could, the path to get the chiller into the building would have required major architectural modifications to get it in. So the solution ended up in that case taking some of the site central utilities and putting a heat exchanger on the inlet to the existing chiller to boost that temperature down so that it could handle the load. So sometimes you just end up having to be forced into these really creative solutions that you wouldn't have designed originally that way, but you've got to work with what you find, and the client's in a bind and find the most cost-effective way to deal with it.
So how would you designate the key areas at risk? I mean, when you go in, you got to design a flexible manufacturing facility, period. So what risk dimensions are you looking at? I mean, where's the risk?
Well, you're going to have a set of operational risks that, in a lot of cases, are going to be driven by either the attributes of the product or the technology that you're going to be dealing with. Those operational risks are the ones that you need to address first, because until you get those identified and consensus on what your solution is, all the other things that are going to follow, you'll never get there. You're going to have to look at the regulatory aspects of it. Going back to the single-use scenario, a lot of organizations don't realize how much input and time it's going to take to go through and really analyze how you are going to ensure product protection in single-use scenarios, especially if it's the first time you've ever done it. The tools are there. The ability to make the various connections and to select tube set design and all the things, it's all there, but it's from a risk standpoint, you have to identify that as early as you possibly can. You're going to have risks associated with the facility itself. They could be as simple as environmental control and monitoring. Some cases they can become very complex, especially if you're in a scenario where you don't have a blank piece of paper to start from. You're now in a renovation or an upgrade scenario, and you've got to fit something new into something that it wasn't designed for. And so you sort of have to prioritize them, but definitely from my standpoint, the operational aspects from a risk perspective that's where you got to start.
Yeah, I think too, you have to recognize that sometimes when we're talking about flexibility and going after that, we trade one risk for the other, and you end up just needing. I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but the example that comes to mind when you're talking about single use is ballrooms. Okay, so ballrooms are extremely flexible, that combination of multiple processes in one room, though, also creates the possibility for mix-ups. It creates the possibility of a bag puncture or some breach of integrity, which you got to play out those scenarios and figure out whether it's worth it to go that direction or another direction. But getting back to something Jeff brought up earlier, process closure, I think is really a great focus in dealing with this issue, and for most manufacturers, taking those open processing operations where you're really relying heavily on operator technique, and you're relying heavily on the clean environment to control product contamination, taking that out of the equation is a big plus. And a side benefit is very often you can reduce the size of classified space, and also reduce your operating costs, reduce your gowning and equipment and utility costs at the same time.
So you mentioned the ballroom, so what facility layout design is going to give me the maximum flexibility? So if I want process A to double up and the process B I'm going to wind down, I mean, you see what I'm saying?
Well, if you think about it in terms of minimizing risk, and you put aside cost and other things and you just want to focus on risk. Well, obviously the segregation aspect through closed systems and the way you define the process allows you that greatest amount of flexibility. The question though becomes, at what point and to what extent are you willing to accept for your project that approach? And a lot of times the give and take becomes, is it the optimal solution? Maybe not. If you think about it in terms of scale, for example, if you've designed an asset that is focused on, say, a range of 20 to 200 liters, and then all of a sudden there's a need for an increase in that scale capability to 500 liters. You may find yourself in a situation where you have a difficult time from a flexibility perspective of being able to introduce that 500 liter scale capacity. So then you ask the question, all right, if I can't scale up, do I scale out? If I do that, then it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. From a utility perspective, have I designed support systems that now allow me the option to scale out? So it's the domino effect, and that becomes part of the challenge when you start looking at this definition of what flexibility actually means to you.
I'm a big proponent of scale out, by the way.
It makes life a lot simpler, and I know from the standpoint of especially if you're looking at a blank piece of paper, your ability to scale out, expand, looking at the agility factor becomes so much more efficient. And I think that as the industry continues to mature, you're going to see more and more organizations sort of, I don't want to say totally abandon the idea of scale up, but scale out is where I think a lot of organizations are going, especially in single-use implementation. It just simplifies life. It really does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in a traditional facility, you deal with that by creating shell spaces,
Yeah.
or by constructing a utility spine and with phases of expansion in the facility to be able to accommodate future needs and future demand. In a single-use facility, I'm going to respectfully disagree a little bit. I'm not 100% sold on scale out. Only because single use is a labor-intensive process. It's got to, and it's extremely sensitive to the manipulation of the operators to how well it will work. So if you handle a bag wrong, you don't install it properly, you'll end up with integrity issues and problems. And you know, for years before the introduction of these systems, we were scaling up and we were highly automating to get people out of the process, and now they're back in. So in terms of my vision for the future, I don't see traditional facilities going away completely. I see manufacturers that have hybrid solutions, you know, single use where it makes sense, stainless where it makes sense. I see manufacturers that will use it strategically, depending on whether it's clinical or production. I think there's a great synergy between single-use and continuous manufacturing, because the limitation on single-use is scale when you think about it, and that's what makes you scale out in the first place. You get too big where you can't handle a bag anymore, you can't roll it down the hall anymore. So if you can eliminate that scale limitation by having a continuous single-use process, you've got the process closure that single-use technology gives you, which is really crucial for continuous manufacturing, especially for biologics, and you've got the expandability without having to scale out that comes as a result of that.
Well, I I agree. All I can tell you is one of the things we learned on the small molecule side was a crucial piece that came from the biotech side, and that was we scale out now. We found that, yeah, for the same reason.
Yeah.
Catastrophe beckons when you go to the scale.
Well, and one point that Dave made is 100% correct, and that is every time you create a touch point where the operator now becomes really the primary element in your ability to control the process, you're introducing an element of risk. Regardless of how good we all think we may be, it's a truism.
Right.
And it sort of goes back to what I said earlier. The challenge that I think we all have as we move forward from a design standpoint is trying to figure out ways to make those interface points as seamless and controlled as we possibly can. And I agree with his statement that when you start talking scale out and you talk single use implementation, there is a variable there that you have to contend with. I think the challenge from the industry standpoint is one that we're going to have to figure that out in order to, and quite honestly, if you look at some of the hesitation from a regulatory standpoint that we continue to see, that will help that regulatory uncertainty. Now, what exactly those solutions are going to be, I don't know. I mean, Parrish probably knows. GE's right in the middle of it, but that is a key element of what flexibility is going to mean to the industry as we move forward. Is how do we control those human interface points?
The scale out. I mean, single use. If you're not going continuous, that's your only option,
Yep.
right? To produce more product, you need more operations. I think there's another good reason, though, to scale out instead of scaling up, and that really depends on your unit operations. So not all unit operations are easily scalable, so in order to efficiently scale up, you need to have a measure of process development, and there's always a risk with every jump in scale. It's going to take a period of time to tune that process, to optimize it. Getting back to your process tuning question, and so you can avoid that obviously if you just create a clone, and perhaps it's your strategy to market that's driving it. Perhaps you scale out by putting facilities across the world that are clones close to their market, and that makes distribution easier and solves some other problems as well.
Yeah, there's quite a few. I mean, philosophically, we could sit here and just that part alone we can beat to death. But
We'd have to have alcohol.
no, that's it. It's drink time. But I want to thank everybody and our speakers. That's it for today.